This is Big Man Tyrone, and you're about to watch the MtG Cabal cast with your hosts, Woad, Thirsty, and Reptar. Sub to us on all your podcast networks at MtG Cabal Cast and YouTube.
Alrighty, guys, welcome to the newest episode of the Cabal cast. So, what we're going to be targeting this week is actually a question that was raised by one of the patrons, which, in light of all the old school reserve list surge, everything, basically, like, what we really look for when we're targeting old school and the reserve list staples for EDH or playability. Like, what makes a good spec on this stuff? So we've got a few different headlines we're going to go through and, express our opinions. So let's take it away.
Yep. This is going to be part one of two, just because the topic overall is pretty dense and we don't want to put like an hour and a half episode out that's all topic, because that gets boring real quick. So the first thing we want to talk about when we're looking at old school or reserve list EDH playables, staples, if you want to look at them that way, is what in particular do you look for? Is it something like a low-hanging fruit? Is it a card whose floor is currently low but has an extremely high ceiling? Or is it based on price history? Has the card been too flat for too long based on utility? Is the card currently seeing an uptick with the possibility that once demand pulls as many copies as they can out of the market, the price eventually goes up, so you're able to restock at your own price on TCG Player or sell it to buy lists, and just kind of discuss that first bullet point. And I've kind of broken this out into two different pieces, one for reserve list cards and one for old school cards, because when I look at this stuff, it is very different for me. Because as you look at the reserve list versus some of the cards that are popular in old school, you'll notice that while there is disparate power level between a lot of what's going on in those two avenues, they still function extremely differently and oftentimes independently from one another. So,
for me, I'm, as some of my picks have dictated recently, Emberwild Caliph being a prime example. Look, it's on the reserve list. It's going to go up. Who cares? Like, dump whatever at it. You can't lose money, because at this point, the FOMO on it is so real on that stuff that it's difficult to miss. It's like literally granted a 5-year period, there is 0% chance you don't make money on these cards. Now, I think, are some things better than others? Obviously, yeah. If you've got a price history of a card like Grim Feast, which I picked very early on the cast, and we've seen multiple surges now since. Looking at the stocks graph, there was one in 2018, one in mid-2020, and we're in the middle of another one now. This has price history. So to me, if this tanks again after this surge, which granted the last couple surges saw floor set at about 25% less than the surge. So if we see a new floor set, great, get it on the floor. It's going to gain long term. It's just going to gain it a little bit faster than something like an Emberwild Caliph. That said, Emberwild being a low-hanging fruit, percentage-wise, the ceiling on that seems a lot higher to me. So that's one that I may be willing to go super deep on and be like, all right, I've got 200 copies of Emberwild Caliph. What pays off first, Sarkhan's Unsealing or Emberwild Caliph? I bet you it's Emberwild Caliph, unfortunately.
When it comes to reserve list stuff, I function differently, and not because I don't think that low-hanging fruit aren't where you want to be or that you won't make money on reserve list cards. I like to see cards that have immediate utility. So I want them to be eminently playable because something was just released or maybe they're overlooked. And a good example of the first card, or the first thing, is Second Chance. So let me bring this up. So Second Chance falls into the same category of cards that you were picking a couple of weeks ago, where once there's a trigger within the game itself, you can then sacrifice the enchantment to do X, Y, or Z. In the case of Second Chance, it's take an extra turn. So Second Chance, as you can see on stocks, just kind of sawtooth for a really long time before eventually going up. And the reason for this pick and the impetus for the raise in price is the release of Hall of Heliod's Generosity, a card from Modern Horizons that basically allows you to just take infinite turns with Second Chance because you just keep putting it on top of your library. This is Volrath's Stronghold for enchantments, and Second Chance is what allows you to craft a game-winning state. So that's what I'm looking for. I don't just want synergies. I want cards that actually can win the game. Another example is Paradigm Shift. Paradigm Shift, another reserve list card that just kind of sat around. We did see a bump in 2018, and then it did nothing until we got Thassa's Oracle, and now it's through the roof because it's a 2-card combo with Thassa's Oracle. It's another, arrow in that quiver. It's a mono blue combo, so it can slide into any deck where you want to play Thassa's Oracle, be it 2-color, 3-color, 1-color, what have you. And these are cards that I like over something like Wall of Kelp, which is our perennial whipping boy, because that's a synergistic card. It's unnecessary to the strategy, and while it does provide returns, they're generally fleeting because you have to be in and out quickly, and the long-term gains on something like Wall of Kelp, while they're there, will not be as great as cards that, to me, have this kind of utility and can craft, winning board states from small interactions. So there's that, and then my second category, and this one is a lot more like touchy-feely, is our iconic cards. So for a while, Baron Sengir sat and did nothing, like literal nothing, forever. It was, $2 a card, and then eventually started to spike with the reserve list push. And it's not like we got a whole bunch of vampires that Baron Sengir floats into. Baron Sengir is just an iconic card from the beginning of the game. It harkens back to a piece of nostalgia. It's not really played anywhere, even within EDH. It's very light play. But the idea that this card was at $2 on the reserve list, had nostalgia, and is iconic to the game is kind of just an oversight if you weren't going to buy into this. Comparatively speaking, something like Boris Devilboon does not really have that bit of iconography behind it, but has a real price because of what we're seeing right now with the Legends bump. So I would not have picked Boris Devilboon because of what this card represents, and a number of the other cards from Legends that we did talk about, Jacques Levert, etc., that really have no other power to them beyond what's lent from being on the reserve list compared to something like Baron Sengir. So that's what I'm looking for. Like, Baron Sengir was a low-hanging fruit option, but with that bit of mystique around it.
Yeah, and it's interesting too that a little bit of the bump played into the new Baron Sengir that we got. Independent of that, though, it's still not seeing a whole lot of play. So it's one of those, like, it's iconic, and it's iconic from a time that not a lot of the current audience played during. But when eyes are drawn to it and it's like, oh, this is an older version of this card, little Timmy sees it and says, well, I want both Baron Sengirs at the same time, and just buys it. And you combine that with the reserve list factor into it, and of course, again, it's a guaranteed way to make money. It's as close as it gets to a sure thing in Magic.
No, absolutely. And so for me, when I'm looking at the reserve list and I'm looking at what I want to pick from there, what I want to spec on, that's really what I'm looking for. I'm not looking to say, okay, well, this is underserved and creates this great piece of strategery, or it slots into something. What's the card that makes the Sand Warriors that's worth like infinite money right now? Hasazan Tamar.
Yeah.
Hasazan Tamar makes tokens that are Sand Space Warriors. They have that creature type as well, Sand and Warrior. And it is super unique in what it does, but it's not the greatest general in that slot. It just has an infinite price because of reserve list charm, essentially.
Yep. And it's a unique card, and it's, it doesn't have the iconic thing, but it does have the reserve list going for it, and Legends bump, which, as an aside, something else to look for is, as these reserve list weights hit, what's coming next. And we talked about it in a previous episode when I said, you've got this like middle ground of like a Mirage Weatherlight block that hadn't really been hit at that time. And now all of a sudden, these cards are getting hit in force. So if you see these cycles go through and you can get ahead of them, it's another good way to make your margin. More on the, Weatherlight surge later, but that's an important aside that, Legends goes through periods where it does jump. And first you'll see Chains and Tabernacle and all these the big ones cards jump. But you'll see, Weatherlight and Mirage follow along.
Hey, bud.
All right, let's go, Fleabag.
So when it comes to old school non-reserve list cards, does your methodology change at all, or do you kind of stick to the same thing?
So for old school, it's less about sure thing and more about where can I make money.
Okay.
So it's a lot more about the playability.
Yep.
Similar to what you said, it's not just because JMA Tome sees play in old school doesn't mean I'm going to target that card.
Mm-hmm.
It's not that it has playability outside of old school. So in that case, there's some friends of mine that play a lot of old school, and I'll lean on them honestly. I'll say, look, this card's, the deck is super popular in the meta right now. Do any of those cards, do you think they'll see play elsewhere? 90% of the time, they're like, nah, man, not really.
Yep.
There's just more efficient ways to do that. That said, there are cards in old school that do have a little bit of financial viability that I'll target. Shivan Dragon is a key one. It holds that icon status. Yep. And it was printed in core set after core set after core set in those learner decks, and then all of a sudden it stopped printing. And that was this huge deal that all of a sudden people started buying, and you saw a little bit of a bump in Shivan Dragon. So on old school, I look much more for playability and, similar to Hall of Heliod's Generosity or, think twice. What's a card that's played here that's really only one or two cards away from being huge outside of OS? And that's kind of what I target.
Yep. So I look for, with old school cards in particular, not for old school, but for EDH, efficient spells. So I want efficiency. And for me, the largest spec I have on an old school card that isn't on the reserve list is actually Soul Exchange from Fallen Empires.
Yeah, that card's great.
Yeah, and we just see it be flat for a while, and you say, okay, well, why Soul Exchange? And the reason I like Soul Exchange is this is a reanimation spell that costs 2, like Exhume. But instead of being a parallel effect like Exhume, where you and an opponent reanimate a creature, this asks you to exile a creature, and it doesn't specify non-token. So you exile a creature, and then you reanimate another creature from your graveyard. And then there's the clause of put a +2/+2 counter on this creature if the creature sacrificed was a Thrall. So when we got Commander Legends and everybody was looking at Thrall Champion, which is on the reserve list as a spec for that, I was going through some odds and end cards that had the word Thrall. I didn't care about kobolds. And I came up with Soul Exchange. And this is a super efficient reanimation spell. It just requires that starter. And I think this is a card that has huge playability throughout the entirety of the EDH format. Yes, having a creature in play to sacrifice is a much larger ask than just having one in your graveyard, but it's not that uncommon that you should be able to activate the spell shortly after turn 2. Now, compare this... Now, the price on this is cents compared to something like Eater of the Dead, which is a card from the Dark. Both of these were uncommons, I believe. And Eater of the Dead is not on the reserve list, but Eater of the Dead does one thing and one thing only. It commands a $15 price tag. Eater of the Dead allows you to combo out with a mill deck, be it self-mill or milling an opponent out, thanks to Phaenax. You just activate Eater of the Dead using Phaenax's ability to start the mill chain, and then you use Eater of the Dead's activated ability to remove a creature card from a graveyard to untap it. So that's infinite mill. You can mill the table out right there. Now, the problem is with these two cards, Eater of the Dead, like I said, only does one thing and one thing only. Soul Exchange has much wider applications. So I see Soul Exchange as a much more efficient card that can play across the format, and I'm happy sinking, I think it was like quarters into this spell when Commander Legends released, to buy nigh infinite quantity and sit on it. And like I said, it's really the only card I've done that with for old school. But as we continue to look back at that era, that's what I'm going to be looking for, is efficiencies and commonalities between what cards are doing and what's popular in the format.
And I think that's important because old school is one of the most unique formats in Magic, because the interaction there is, you look at existing decks from back then, right? And those more or less still exist today, but they have modern deck building applied to them. So there's a lot more opportunity that even if you were alive and playing then, you might not necessarily see without taking an in-depth analysis of all right, well, now that we understand even what virtual card advantage is, how much better is a card like Sylvan Library from back then?
Yep.
And it's worth looking into, and I think Soul Exchange is a prime example of this is a card that is incredibly efficient by modern deck building standards. Yep. And back then may not have been seen as a good, powerful card.
Yeah, the cost of creatures was fairly prohibitive back then, so having a board state where it was worthwhile to bring something large enough back was probably not really what you were approaching when playing this game. And you think about it with Fallen Empires, what are you going to be bringing back that's big enough? And you look at, okay, you have Juzem, you have Shivan, you have Sarah Sengir, and that's really it. I can't think of many more creatures with
the best art ever
greater.
in Magic, Eben Praetor.
Yep. You have Praetor and the blue Jin and the green Jin, not Mahamati, Urnum and Serendipity.
Yep.
These are like highly efficient cards you can get back. Are you going to be reanimating it though? No, probably not. But this is a card that exists in the old school environment. It falls under that umbrella, though it's in Fallen Empire, so it's outside of a lot of the rule sets, but it does have very real play in EDH and has very real applications outside of just a generic Thrall deck in EDH. And so that's what I look for, which is why I don't really spec a lot on cards from the old school era that aren't reserve list. It's very difficult to find a lot of these highly efficient cards that don't already have a high price tag. So, you leaned on Sylvan Library, look at Concordant Crossroads. That card, a global enchantment that gives all creatures haste for 1 green. Both the Legends and is it Chronicles or Fifth? One of the printings, they're both like $100 some now.
Yeah.
For that card, because it is extremely efficient at what it does. And to find these efficiencies takes time, and generally speaking, they will have a real price tag attached to them. So it's difficult to do this kind of speculation in my experience. But
yeah,
moving from that, where are you looking to pick up cards when you're looking at reserve list or old school stuff?
So, obviously there's the global TCG marketplace. That's a thing. TCG Player, MKM. One of the things I do first, though, is I'll put a buying post or scour Facebook groups, because what I like to do with these cards is hit them in the places where supply won't be noticed first.
Okay.
Because long term, I feel like that's a little bit better, because especially when dealing with reserved list, and especially when dealing with reserved list staples that see play in EDH, FOMO is absurd with these cards. Mm-hmm. So if you go in and you buy a bunch of them, well, guess what? Unfortunately, you're going to double your price overnight and probably see a decent amount of those get canceled on you, which is obviously not great. Prime example, granted, this is not reserve list. When hitting Planar Collapse recently, one of the sellers canceled on me because I bought out up to $100. Well, they canceled and immediately listed for $150 and haven't sold a single copy since. Anyways, I like hitting those places first, because generally speaking, you're not going to trigger FOMO. Mm-hmm. You can affect the supply, if nothing else, without people really noticing. And I'm worried about that. So what I'll do is probably for about a week, hit up Facebook. Then the first thing I do is hit up Card Kingdom and Abu. And the reason I do that, and this is like literally the series I'll go through, is because their prices are on an algorithm based on TCG. So I want to hit TCG last, because you hit them first and sell out of stock. Their buy prices will stay where they are. Then you hit TCG, and that's when their buy prices start to shift. So if you want to get a quick flip on it, you can. Generally, that's where I look, how I look. I think that Card Kingdom is one that you have to keep an eye on, because they do gatekeep, which Abu does as well. So what they'll do is they'll only let you buy, I think, 8 of a rare.
Yes.
After it's released. Like pre-release, you can only buy 4, but after that, you can buy 8 of a rare. They may have more than 8. What they'll do is they'll sell those 8 and then relist 8 at a percentage above that, like clockwork. And that's basically their algorithm to prevent buyouts. Yep. Now, a lot of times on the reserve list stuff, they just don't have the quantity for it to really matter that much, and that's one of the reasons I like to hit there first. Mm-hmm. I generally try to avoid MKM, especially when it comes to old school, because old school lives in Europe by and large, and that's where you're going to have inflated prices, and it's going to be harder to make a margin.
Yep.
So just what I keep an eye out for. What about you? How do you go?
A lot of that is actually fairly similar. However, I start outside the U.S. I start with Japan, and I start with European marketplaces, because I'm looking at EDH cards, and even though they're reserve list, as long as there's no overlap between EDH and old school or other constructed formats, it was and can still be easier to pull quantity from outside of not just the U.S. but North America. Oftentimes, this does mean that I do have to use an intermediary in the EU to bundle everything and ship it, but generally speaking, that's going to be worth it. Rarely do I actually have the ability to buy EDH reserve list specs in quantity within the US. As you mentioned, it's very hard to find on CK, etc. But I do check TCG, Troll, and Card Kingdom because for the most part, that's where the largest quantities for a lot of the lower hanging specs that I'm looking at exist. CK limits you to 8 on rares. TCG player, you can oftentimes bundle a couple things, and Troll just lists everything if they have it, so it just makes it a quick and easy check. Of note, though, you mentioned CK does gatekeep on rares to 8, but if you're looking for uncommons or commons, they just, I think, list either 20 or however many they have. So if you're looking at like Mystic Remora, for instance, there's 20 some up right now. But the reason I start outside the US, as I mentioned, is that those are the markets that underserve EDH for the most part right now. And despite the fact that Japan is kind of coming along with EDH, they're starting to run more events, their format as a whole is not as casual as the US format and the way people play. So it's a lot easier to pull things like Second Chance. This isn't a reserve list, but like Penman's Aura was pretty easy to pull out of Japan for cheap and in comparison. And my timelines for churn on this are always long enough. Usually I'm looking at like a year or more. So the shipping cost and time to receive are rarely a factor. I just need to buy, quantity as easily as possible. And as I mentioned, like I can't really get quantity within the US because it's usually drained or just non-existent. And the best that I can generally do are like bundles or of 1 to 2 from TCG Player or other vendors. And then it's just sitting down and calculating price, cost of good, which includes shipping and taxes, and then see what adds up where and how and what my best avenue for maximum quantity is going to be. For old school, it's a little bit different. I actually invert it. I've had my best purchases come from TCG Player in terms of overall quantity because it's just been easier there to find. People are just listing as much as they can because they don't have their own sites. They're not large vendors. This is just quantity coming in from bulk buys, etc. That's just sitting there. And so I start with the open marketplace, and eventually I'll move to close. The closed marketplaces, meaning vendors, and I'll usually end up paying less overall, as the threshold for free shipping is less on TCG Player than a normal vendor. It can be anywhere from $5 to $35, depending on what the seller wants to do. Usually it's around $5, which is a very easy mark to hit. And then once I'm done with TCG Player, I always check Card Kingdom, because as I mentioned, while they do serve EDH players, if it's a common or uncommon, they're going to list as much as they have, and they're fairly reliable with their quantities. The main issue I have is with CK and Troll. They do offer free shipping, but it's a $25 threshold, which oftentimes isn't enough to get to because they don't have the quantity. So again, it comes down to weighing the larger upfront cost on the item itself, because they're the closed marketplace. I'm paying their prices plus shipping, and then see what my numbers look like. And if I think it's good enough, then I will extract quantity from those vendors. But it just takes a little more time and a little more math overall. But like I said, I start in the open marketplace and then work my way down. I very rarely look into Japan or MKM for this, because oftentimes it's just sometimes so bulk, Soul Exchange, like so bulk, it just wasn't there, or it was so hard to try and get in quantity from MKM that the number of packages I was going to receive, I would have lost my
prohibitive.
Exactly, I would have lost my ass on the individual shipping for like 1 to 4 ofs.
Is any of this different for you for foils?
I like to go for foils from the open market. It's not that I trust the open market more for foils. I just like the overall competitive pricing in the open marketplace for foils. The last foil that I spec'd on was Essica's Chariot Showcase, and I don't regret it because they are slightly bent. I should be able to get out of those over time as they flatten out at a profit, but it's hard to beat companies like the Gaming Co.
Yeah.
They list such incredible quantity at such low prices that I always start with TCG Player and then work my way out. Troll can also have really good prices for early foils within the lifespan of a set that aren't the talked about cards during spoiler season. So again, I can lean on Essica's Chariot. The price point at CK and Troll for that card in particular was very appealing, but the quantity that I was able to pull was not what I wanted, so I went with the open marketplace. But because that card had not really been talked about that often in spoiler season, it only was a couple of weeks later that it was kind of found to be extremely good in the Sultai Ultimatum deck, that their prices were very close to the open market.
So for me, I try to, honestly, when I hit foils, I actually try to hit like Haruruya first. They just are incredibly competitive on their English foil prices.
Yep.
So I'll always try to go there first. That's just how it works for me. I think it's worth noting, though, that especially on the reserve list foils, it's a lot harder to find your spot. Because a lot of them now, a while ago, I was like, look, your sub $100 reserve list foils are where it's at. Those will be over $100. And now here we are. I mean, you can't get any of them for less than $100 even anymore.
I don't muck around with reserve list foils. Just, it's too much money to sink into a single copy of a card for me to be happy with that.
I think if it is, especially now, because they are all over $100, when they weren't, obviously you could do it. Now it's kind of, it's not as sure thing just because of, the liquidity of the card.
Yep.
For me, compared to what it used to be. I mean, all things equal, look, a foil Weatherseed Treefolk is not the same as a foil Radiant Archangel.
No.
It's not. Even if the prices are the same, they're not the same thing. One of those actually has playability and utility, and the other is a 5-mana green 5/3. So that's where you kind of have to be a little bit choosier on what you're doing.
Yep.
For me, is if I were to hit reserve list foils, I have to be much more selective in what I'm hitting. I want to hit a card like Palancron. Now, I don't want to hit Weatherseed Treefolk. Is Palancron significantly more? Yeah, obviously. But it's also actually more liquid despite being significantly more. So something that just plays into that, and something that I think you need to be mindful of when looking at these cards, is this kind of viability. With foils, is the playability and liquidity is significantly more important than it is otherwise.
Yeah, I think if you're going to spec on foils for standard and pre-release time, it's basically the same mentality. You need to look at that card and evaluate it and ensure that it's good enough to see play either in something like EDH, which is why I bought Essica's Chariot initially, and I also talked about it in our Caltime pre-release show.
Yeah.
And if you're going to be buying reserve list foils, you need to be damn sure that these cards are playable. You're not just buying chaff because it's cheap. If you want to park money, then you can absolutely do that. But if you want to see a faster ROI and a larger ROI, then you're going to need to make sure that these cards actually are viable within the format. So, yeah. I don't think I have much more to really to talk over about my method and what I look for. Like I said, it's very much the same thing for me. I just kind of reverse based on stock levels, essentially, and where I think I can pull. I have tried to do EDH foils from Haruruya before, and it has worked out well, though the last time I tried to do that, my order got canceled because COVID, so who knows anymore, and I stopped honestly paying attention to the site because I can't extract anything. But at the same time, if you're able to, because you either live outside the US or you have connections that can buy for you from Haruruya and then ship your product over, don't just flow through the site normally searching for cards. Hit their sales. Their sales are ridiculous for everything. Recently I've just been seeing a lot of Japanese stuff go up, but oftentimes there will be English mixed in, and you can, generally speaking, arbitrage pretty easily almost everything from those sales from Haruruya to whatever your local scene is, be it to actual local players or if you're going to be listing on market space. Super viable.
It's definitely something to keep an eye on, especially now without events. If you're servicing a local marketplace, it may actually behoove you to have a stock of those like foreign cards that people, had easy access to.
Yep.
Back when we had GPs. So it's definitely, even for the Japanese stuff, worth a check now and then.
Yep. Full visibility, I was looking to pull as many ley line of anticipations as I could because they were like 60% USD, both English and Japanese. So I was just going to flat buy them out of the most recent core set version, and that's when I learned that they weren't shipping from Japan to the US. Like, things like that happen all the time because, as I mentioned before, the Japanese EDH environment is not the same as the US EDH environment. And so cards that you think are fairly ubiquitous here are not there, and there still exists that opportunity. Yeah. And it's awesome.
It is.
Picks? Or you got more?
Yes.
All right.
Let's do picks. I'll go first since you did last week. So I am revisiting an old pick, and that is Pendrell Mists. So, as I mentioned earlier, you see these spikes come in waves on sets. So you see back in 2018, if you look at the stocks graph, this was actually when the Cabal first hit it. It went up to $20, and then it slowly petered back down. And then, of course, the reserve list spike in fall of 2020 hit. All of a sudden, Pendrell Mist shoots up to $10, and then it craters a little bit, but shoots up to $20. So why am I picking this card on the heels of a spike where it's starting to dip? Well, because again, it's starting to dip. You can buy into the dip. 2, look at the price of Tabernacle right now. This is the exact same thing as Tabernacle in an enchantment in blue. It is an incredibly high impact effect. Now, if you look at the price history on some cards from a similar time period, Grim Feast is one that spikes a few times, hits a floor, and like I mentioned, the floor is always about 25% lower. There is no reason in a year we don't see Pendrell Mists at $75 because this ability is incredibly impactful. It's an affordable alternative for people that are in blue that run Tabernacle, and it's reserve list from a set that had a pretty decent print run, sure.
Yep.
But this has a history, this has a high impact, and this is one of those cards that was bulk forever. So people may have just gotten rid of it. I am sure I threw I don't know how many copies of this card into the dumpster when I would move houses and not want to take 500,000 bulk with me. It happens. Now, looking at stock, currently we're sitting at about, I think it's 98 total listings on TCG. If you filter for LP or near mint, 2/3 of those are LP or near mint. So this is something that's a lot more of a slow burn because it isn't until the third page that you hit $30 on this card. So this is something where you can periodically buy up a couple copies every few weeks, not trigger FOMO, and just sit on them.
Yep.
It's a very slow roll, slow burn. You're not going to spike it overnight and then shoot it up to $100 like you could with Planar Collapse a couple weeks ago. You're going to slow burn this one. But I think even getting in at retail now at $30, or sorry, 22, 23, is great because long term, this card should hit a $50 buy list. I would think, based on what we're seeing with the reserve list, sometime within the next year. Worst case scenario, you will never sell this card for less than $25.
Nope.
Not happening.
And your delta between Card Kingdom buy list credit and the TCG player low is about $5 right now. So you're going to close in pretty quickly, and Card Kingdom is buying 26 copies, which is a pretty significant number based on the amount of stock available on the open market itself. So it still remains a good pick. Eventually, it's just going to fall off because these cycles will continue to raise the floor to a point where it becomes no longer viable to buy low, sell high, and you basically get to keep re-upping. It's just we're looking at what is it like a yearly increases.
Yeah, pretty much.
I have yet to run play against anybody playing Pendrell Mists, but I can't imagine it's going to be a good time. So I will continue to like this card until it prices itself out of the market space. But I'm going to move over to something way more casual. My spec for the week is Dragon Tyrant from Scourge. Scourge?
Fucking love that card.
Dude, it is big and dumb. They come big and dumber, but there are not many more that are this big or this dumb.
No.
So looking at Dragon Tyrant, it really doesn't fall into the Dragon Tribal decks just yet. It really goes more into, I like to call it Dragon Combo, or just kind of sneak or sneak attack combo. And I'll bring up.
Get fatties into play.
Yeah. So the top commander is Zerlin of the Claw, which is basically sneak attack. Perforos, Bronze Blooded, which is basically just sneak attack. Ilhard, the Razeboar, which is basically, again, just sneak attack. And then you see both Dragons in here. And so you kind of get this picture that this is a card that you just want to cheat into play. Primarily because it's a 6/6 with double strike, flying trample, and partly because it has a 4 red upkeep cost. So, difficult card. So this isn't the biggest dragon out there. If you do a gatherer search for dragons with power greater than 6, there's like 15 or plus. But there are only 5 dragons total in the history of the game with double strike, and this is one of 2 dragons with double strike that has power greater than 5. The other is Dragon Lord Atarka, right? Everything else with double strike has power like 2, 3, and 4. So this slots into Dragon Combo fairly easily, or similar decks helped by, as I mentioned, Zerlin, Perforos, and Ilharg. The taller ask is adding this into Dragon Tribal decks because of the quad red upkeep, as it's a really steep price to pay for a deck that is extremely mana hungry and can win without this card fairly easily, thanks to some of the multicolored offerings within the Dragon Tribe already. In time, thanks to Dragon's Approach from Strixhaven, we might see a change overall in the approach taken to the Dragon Tribal deck, and we could see an increase in demand as that deck becomes a little more popular. And I'll bring up Dragon's Approach. I realized I didn't have it up. So this is Dragon's Approach. It's a sorcery from Strixhaven for 2 and a red. Dragon's Approach deals 3 damage to each opponent. You may exile Dragon's Approach and 4 other cards named Dragon's Approach from your graveyard. If you do, search your library for a dragon creature card, put it onto the battlefield, and shuffle. And a deck can contain any number of cards named Dragon's Approach. So this card is actually responsible for a number of the dragon spikes that we saw over the past week, like Hellkite Tyrant, Hellkite Overlord, and stuff like that. There are a lot of them that went. Dragon Tyrant sits fairly low because everything else goes in the tribal deck. This goes in the sneak attack version of the deck. So my initial projections for Dragon Tyrant was basically, when I put this on my list around December, probably summer, as we are heading into the Dungeons and Dragons set, because you can't build a Dungeons and Dragons set without dragons. It's in the name.
Or dungeons.
Yes. So when I put this card on here, I expect it to be during that spoiler season. That's when it would pick up. But Dragon's Approach has really kind of sped up our timeline, because now we have a way to cheat this thing into play. We can go tutor it up with Dragon's Approach in the sneak attack decks. So my expectation has been reset, and we should see break even before the D&D set, and we should start seeing gains thereafter. So from right now, it's probably about 6 to 9 months, but we could be seeing things a little faster than that. A note on reprint equity is that with a simplification of various aspects of the game, the upkeep cost on this should crater the reprint equity. And if we do see it, then I would expect it to be in the D&D commander sets, because red dragons are generally the quote-unquote end of campaign level threats. So this could be something in that deck.
That's the only point I'd be worried about, is if we see it in that, because Dragon Tyrant isn't like a type of dragon in D&D, but it certainly is, like you said, the big bad boss at the end of the campaign.
Yep. And there has been movement on both Card Kingdom and TCG. I realized I skipped over this. In December, Card Kingdom was buying 18 at $1.15. They're now buying 19 at $1.50, so buy list has gone up, and the quantity has basically stayed static. On TCG, in December, there were 150 at $1.70, LP or better. As of last Friday, there were 76 at $1.73. So quantity has dropped overall, but prices stayed about the same, which is kind of quirky to me. But that just tells me all the low-hanging fruit are gone. People that just had this sitting around and just wanted to get something out of it, they pulled it from the market space. And now when we filter, our lowest price is about $2. So while the market price is slowly creeping up towards $2, the actual lowest LP copy is $2 before you add shipping. So we are seeing just gains on this card slowly over time. As far as like how many I would move in on, I'm not entirely certain. I don't think we get hoisted in the D&D set. And for $2, it seems kind of difficult to not want to buy somewhere between like 4 and 12 and just have a couple sets sitting around.
Yeah.
We're not going to see a Dragonstorm combo deck with this threat because it doesn't have haste. It's not good enough or something like that. But as far as like casual EDH goes and sneak attack stuff, like I mentioned, this is one of the largest dragons with double strike. It is the second largest dragon with double strike, in fact. And it just ends the game so efficiently from any of those decks. You can do some wizardry with Braid of Fire and like reduce the upkeep cost on it overall, but I think this is just going to be, you know, a haymaker finisher in these decks now and moving forward.
I think it also, you know, satisfies the Invisibles aspect almost, because this is one of those big dumb cards that people just see, and like when you're new to the game, you see something like that and you're like, that's incredible, because it seems so powerful. And while it doesn't fit into your combo engine, obviously it fits into the cheap big dumb fatties, which, as we've seen recently, especially, cheating cards into play is something Wizards has really like been trying to promote. You know, not just with cards like Ilharg, but we've gotten more and more efficient with these sneak attack type answers. Not to mention they're trying to reprint cards like sneak attack whenever they can, like show and tell, that do these big, impactful, swingy plays. And I think that long term, you know, something like this we may see on the list eventually, but that's a while down the line.
Yep.
I mean, I don't think we're at any risk of seeing this printed in a list or in a standard print run set. You know, when you talked about reprint equity and I mentioned the D&D EDH decks, I literally think it's just EDH decks or bust for this card.
I think so too.
I don't think we see it anywhere else.
No, I think it really is the upkeep cost on this, despite the fact that it costs 10. This thing costs 8 and 2 red for a 6/6, right?
Yeah.
Like, and all the keywords put it well above rate, but then you also have the upkeep on it, and I think that is the prohibitive factor for the reprint. That's why you're not going to see this upcycled into a Modern Horizons set or any kind of actual draftable set, because this card is nigh unplayable in those sets. It has to be something like an EDH set or a theme deck. So
who knows?
Yeah, I think we're safe overall, and we're just waiting on this kind of like casual demand to get there. I did think about the Invisibles, and every time I was thinking about that as I was writing my my notes for this, it's like Dragon Mage or something like that from Scourge.
Yeah.
And actually, like, there are just better dragons to be playing in front of this, so I'm not entirely certain how well this slots into like that kind of casual thing. Like I mentioned, Dragon Lord Atarka has, or maybe it's just Atarka, I can't remember which. One of them has double strike, and it's just a bigger dragon overall for less of a cost with less of an upkeep. But it doesn't slot into the mono red sneak attack deck, where you just want to jam the biggest creatures you can that are the most impactful. Yeah. And so this is, to me, not quite an Invisibles card. It definitely, it absolutely has play there. Don't get me wrong. I just didn't really kind of take that into consideration when I was thinking about this, because there just seems to be more better stuff. That doesn't mean that you still can't make this deck as a kitchen table deck, and you know, in a 60 card environment. You know, Perforos, Bronzeblood, and Ilharg are still pretty cheap. And all you need to do is get this into the graveyard for Ilharg, or in hand, and Faithless Looting and things like that really do allow you to kind of mix and match and get your threats, you know, locked away as necessary. So
yeah, for sure.
I can absolutely see it having play there.
Yeah, I definitely agree with that. I guess I should say it satisfies, like, for me, when I was just starting out, I wanted to do big, dumb,
absolutely,
things.
Yeah.
And, like, it's a good, like, intro player card.
Yeah.
And I think it's, you know, very special circumstances, but I think this does satisfy, like, almost the kind of thing where the people that want this card aren't necessarily the ones that are going to show up in your analytics. They may not show up on EDH Rec. They may not show up on, you know, MTG Top 8 or Goldfish or something like that.
Yeah.
but they do exist.
Oh, exactly. And like I said, a lot of what I was looking at originally was based on the D&D set, not on what could be in Strixhaven. And Dragon's approach really does change things overall. It changes the context of how you're going to play, either, like I said, the Dragon combo decks, the mono red sneak attack, or the Dragon or the Dragon tribal deck. And because of this shakeup, this is where we can see or have be presented to us the opportunity for realistic gains for a card that's been stagnant for a while and now slowly moving. So, yeah. Overall, like I said, it to me just kind of read as a sleeper pick, and I think now's the time to move in, especially with Dragon's approach and everybody looking at like the top layer of like what's the best things we could do, and I'm just down here close to the cellar, like, well, how about this? And
hey, look, I love being a speckless slumlord myself.
Yeah, cellar dweller. Yeah.
Yeah.
So
come on, Sarkhan's Unsealing one day.
I think that's going to be it for this week, and like I said, next week is going to be the larger of the three points that we want to talk about in regards to specking on old school and reserve list staples for EDH. So, thanks for listening to part 1. We'll be back for next week, and you can catch MTG Cabalcast on Twitter or Facebook if you want to talk to us. Otherwise, the podcast is available on Apple Podcast, Google Podcast, or whatever that service is, Stitcher, Audible, not SoundCloud, a bunch of servers. Yeah. We're in it damn near everywhere.
Pretty much, yeah.
And you can catch us individually on Twitter at HaltIamReptar for myself, and you are
at Thirsty Sizzler.
And we'll see you next week.